It's all on camera?
Yes.
Did you get it? All right, there is a sameness to life and there's a strangeness to life. And there's also another reality. And from an ordinary view, from any ordinary view, this other reality is not a better one, it's another one. And there is always another explanation for everything. Subtitle to that is, there's an explanation for everything that's never been used. Which is what real thinking is. It's what something is, if you didn't like the term real thinking, which it came to me, I just used it. Any explanation that's been used, call it X, call it an explanation. You can call it reality if it's publicly, generally accepted. But there's always another one. Now, that's no secret. People do not think about it in any sort of positive or useful manner because there's always another one, such as some psychotic, some person who is deranged from an ordinary view. That life, your local collective intelligence says, so-and-so is true about life. Or here's the explanation, here's the purpose of life, or here is why men and women become romantically involved, or here's why humans treat their family with deference, or should. There's also always another explanation. And ordinary minds would, if just for a second, would say, oh yeah, but if there is another one, then it is non-real. It is in some way verging on insane. It's not psychotic, ravings of a psychotic, at least a neurotic. But there is always another explanation. But what we're going to be talking about is an explanation that is not better, since I already put that in, and it's not worse. From any ordinary view, they cannot put a modifier on it. Except from an ordinary view, if a man heard the statement that there is another reality and there's always another explanation for everything that has not been used, they cannot think of any instance, none, that would fall, speculation. They cannot think of any speculation, an imaginary example of this, wherein it would not have to be modified by saying, well, the other possible explanation is insane. Or the best they could get to probably a positive potential example would be to say, well, if there's another example that is not a worse explanation, then it would be such as maybe religious dreams or dreams of the future, of saying, well, man someday will be a real man, or man will be more humane. At some time man will be able to live by the golden rule. That's in the future, that there is something now that keeps him from accomplishing this. That's about the best they could do, which is meaningless. It's just fairy tales as far as they're concerned. But there is another explanation for everything that is not open to a modifier, that is not open to qualifications. It's not better, and there's not any more to say. I can say it's not more correct, and all of that loses validity, because if you see another explanation for everything, if you see your own, then there is some benefit. It's not really proper to say that it's not a better one. That's why I qualified even that by saying from an ordinary view. For a man to ordinarily consider that there could be another explanation for everything, always, you would have to tell him from an ordinary view now, these explanations are not better vis-a-vis compared to your ordinary view, yours and everyone else's. It's not to say that your current view is wrong. Because if you're satisfied with your current view, then you're a part of the ordinary intelligence, and there's nothing to be said because there's nothing wrong with your explanation. It is workable. It is functional. It is sanity. There is, I was going to tell you maybe another story or two that I wrote for you. To be what we've been calling civilized, to be ordinary, to accept ordinary explanations with all their warts, with all their possible drawbacks, with all their partial flaws in them. There are standard explanations for reality, for things as they are. We could call it collective intelligence. We could call it the mind of the herd, the mind of humanity in general at any particular time and place. But there are really two levels, two forms of being civilized, of being a thinking human, an ordinary thinking human. It ends up that, if we call it civilization for a second, there are two forms of civilization. There's a private civilization and there's a public civilization. It is almost, if you want to go past the term civilization, there are two worlds in which a man can live and does live, a public one and a private one. There are two consciousnesses, a public one and a private one. There are two worlds of conceptions, a public and a private one. The public one thrives, lives on sameness. It breathes conformity, uniformity, predictability. That is sanity. That is being civilized at the public level. It is a commonly held concept of what reality is, and they have an explanation for it, general explanations. And it falls usually within the, well, always within the purview more, to some degree. It may be split up with the human institutions, all the way from religion to science to common sense. But there is a public world of being civilized. There's a public world of being a human. There are limits, is what the sameness refers to, that if you get outside a certain configuration of sameness, obviously in behavior, that's the easy one to pick out. That if you start going down the street wearing your underwear on your head, you're not civilized. If you began to laugh at funerals and to cry when you go to a comedy club. But the sameness that's of some interest having to do with explanations is in here. If you do not operate within the confines of the sameness of public sanity, of the public world of explaining what reality is, then internally, whether your behavior reflects it immediately or not, internally, you are as out of step as would be the man who continually laughs at funerals. It is why that it is true to point out that the city, civilization, the public side of civilization, can only live off of plagiarism. That it has to be a public forum of predictability and of a kind of uniformity. If there is any originality, it has to come in so slowly that it cannot be absorbed out in the public forum in one generation. It will be, whatever term you like, it will be heresy, it will be too avant-garde, or it will be avant-garde, which is too avant-garde for the public good. It will be anomalous. I'm just using the kind of terms that people would say. It would be theoretical. It would be speculative to varying degrees. In one person's lifetime, you might see something go from being absolute heresy to within 20 or 30 years of being a viable possibility. But it does not normally enter into the sameness, into the public reality of human consciousness in one lifetime. if there is any possibility of originality, if there's anything outside the tempo of what change is, and you can see yourself, if you can see outside the limits of public thought, you can see the rate of speed at which things change. Not just out there. All you've got to do is look at yourself. And remember that at one time you were young and you had dreams of something wonderful. And how long did they last? You know, how long can you keep from going to the bathroom after drinking 10 beers? The love, the dream of some extraordinary explanation for life, or some extraordinary place that one might go that would be more fun than playing in a treehouse all day and eating ice cream all day. Just more fun than that. Look how soon it is gone. Look how quickly it is dismissed by others. Look how quickly you accepted their dismissal. Then look how slowly any sort of progress seems to be with a man's internal life, if any. I point that out so that you don't just left with me saying that it doesn't happen in one lifetime, because you could almost pick out technologically what would seem to be exceptions to that. But it has to do with the consciousness, the perception of what reality is in humans. It does not change to any operative degree in a lifetime. And it doesn't really do much within 2 or 3 lifetimes. It takes a long time for the private life of man to change. Which I could ask you, obviously a crowd such as this, we're not surrounded by sarcastic Philistines. So I guess I can ask you that there's no doubt that publicly, behaviorally, physically, well, behaviorally in the physical sense, that humanity has changed by all accounts in the last 50 years, in the last 2,000 years. But then to ask you, can you feel the genetic vibrations of life itself? And ask yourself, has man actually changed privately that much in 2,000 years? A safe bet, if you don't feel an answer immediately, a safe bet is to assume that he hasn't changed as much privately as he has publicly. And of course, once you realize that that is more than a safe bet, it is a kind of mismatching, a kind of unbalancing that I was going to get into between the public and the private conception and explanations of reality that continues, for one reason, to make men rail against, wring their hands over the question of how can man continue to be so dumb, so stupid, so inhumane? Why is it that technology has gone so far that we now have nuclear weapons that cavemen could have only drooled over? And so we have gone to having to kill each other with rocks individually, one person at a time, to now we can wipe out whole entire nations with one bomb. We've done that, and then ordinary people say, but something seems strange here, because we've done that, and yet internally man's as much of a warmonger as cavemen's were. And they think, well, something's out of... And it always ends up shame on man. That, boy, there's something that's... I'm not religious, but boy, there is a flaw in man somewhere. Something's happened, because look at the great technical advances he's made. Nuclear weapons. Not only can we kill each other, we still want to. Not only can we now build these plants to produce not only atomic bombs and weapons, but atomic energy, but look what it does. It pollutes the environment. Boy, are we stupid. It has to do with a certain kind of balance. And I was saying misbalance, mismatch from their view. But it has to do with a balance between the public world of man and the private world of man. And there are two, as far as we can talk about such things, there are two discrete worlds. They're obviously connected, because man, in a sense, is the connection. But there is a difference. And the difference is part of, if not the core basis of humans attacking themselves. that how is it that we have gone so far that we can build weapons of mass destruction, just fantastic weapons. Even pacifists will, shake their head and they'd see a film of an atomic explosion like, God, isn't that beautiful? But Jesus, we're so stupid, we're so mean and evil that we still might use it on each other. And they go away going, oh, what a strange creature be man. There is if you look at man in a simple sense of being a mind and a body, hormonal and neural, you would think that man, from a physical view, would be very tied to what I was calling the public side. There would be the same sorts of things that would make wolves and all social animals hang out together. But you could also take the view, since there's always another explanation, that hormones, a man's physical life, setting aside for a second his intellectual life, would be private. And you could even make the sociological comment, if not argument, that that is why many of man's most basic functions, such as sex, that normally, unless he's a double-barreled exhibitionist, that normally people prefer to do it in private. There are many people who don't feel the need to go out and eat in public. That the closer it is to hormones of staying alive, that if you were given a choice between it being a public or a private undertaking, you would say, well, a man's physical life, his bodily functions, mashing pimples, pulling hairs out of his nose, other unsightly affairs, that his hormonal life would be a private one. Another explanation, though. If you're civilized, you are certainly more than your personal and physical life. You have to get the mind, you have to get a neural life ignited. And once you do that, you now have a public life. You're a social creature. You're civilized to some degree, if you can talk. On this planet, you're civilized. Then the process becomes that kind of distinction between a man's private life, this internal, just physical life, that you could say it's a very fleeting affair, but you could say a very young child before the intellect shows any real manifestations of him being conscious, which is almost impossible to pinpoint, but just some little kid, just a few days, a few weeks old, you could say he's got nothing but a private life. That you can't, you look at him, and if you've got any ability to stare point blank at reality, you would say, well, I can't see any display of any consciousness. I mean, he'll follow my fingers, his eyes, sort of, sometimes, but he has trouble even focusing his eyes. Whatever life he has is a private life. But he is not a human, in a sense. You're not a human until this starts. That's just, everyone accepts that. If this does not operate, if it in fact malfunctions, you all know that people, the more civilized the parents are, in a sense, the worse they suffer than if the kid had a club foot, or if he was deaf, is to have intellectual problems, neural problems. It's just because a man who can think with a club foot can still become a world famous scientist. He can make the family happy, proud. Everybody gets used to him limping. But if you got the brains, if your IQ is won't reach the cholesterol level of a chicken, I guess the family will still love the little tyke, but life is not the same. It's not like you have a child. You're not human without a mind working at some minimal level. So we have the process that man starts off and is like, to make the comparison again, if you took ordinary animals that are sociable, even though they hang out in packs, you look at a wolf and you would see the same degree of consciousness in the eyes you just simply should be able to feel it, as you would a kid 2 or 3 days old. They hang out together, but it is all mechanical. It is all hormonal. It is all genetic. There's no doubt about it. Wolves do not sit around and think, will I be a hermit? Or should I go hang out with the pack and fit in? They got no choice. If they are a sane wolf, they end up hanging out. So they apparently have some sort of public existence, but they do not. They're private. They are all hormonal. A man starts out the same way. But to become a real man, he has to go past that point, and this has to fire up. Then, what was private becomes public. For the mind to become ignited, for a person to become civilized, for a person to become a real human, they have to take their inner life, what was their inner life, and they have to take it public. They have to, it primarily amounts to people talking about how they feel. They have to take what was their private, personal, inner life, and they have to take it out and make it public. They have to, in fact, through talk, turn it into public property. If you do not, even your family considers that something is wrong. You do not have to have a physical problem with your nervous system. It would then be considered a psychological problem. It is thus that all behavior is questionable by the majority of the public. It's quite questionable, such areas as being a hermit. It is in fact questionable being a monk. It takes on a certain, generally more acceptable patina. That, well, he thinks he's doing it for good reasons. Whereas a hermit, usually people think, well, he's just an old sorehead. He just moved up in the woods and he won't come out. Or general neurotic behavior, which is not being sufficiently public-minded. That is what all forms of so-called psychological problems, if they're not, I'm just taking their descriptions now, if they are not physically, if it's not a physical problem, that if it's indeed, if there is such a thing, I'm just using their descriptions, the public's, if there is such a thing as a true psychological problem, nothing physically amiss with a man, then he's purely neurotic, if not psychotic. And it's only one thing. He has not sufficiently made himself public. He is not publicly oriented to a sufficient degree. That is what they call neuroses. What people end up doing to be sane is they take what was their, not that it's wrong, but they take what was previously their silent internal life and they make it public. They join in. They become part of the social organization of their time. And you have no choice. Contrary, if you in some way attempted not to join in early enough that before it actually happened to you, then they would have you in counseling if your parents were public-minded, if they were civilized, because they would know something, you're antisocial. Something's wrong. I assume they'd go through the easy ones first and check whether you have lexdexia, or whether you have reading problems, whether you have brain damage, whether something is wrong. And if you did not, they would put you into counseling. And who knows why? They don't know the problem. They'd turn you over to a psychiatrist or send you to a priest. But you are, I guess they, in our part of the world, we call it antisocial. You don't, your socialing skills aren't up to par. You are not sufficiently publicly oriented because you have got to share. You have got to talk. And you have got to say how you feel. And any of you who do not have children, all you got to do is think for a second. If your sister a friend, somebody said, I've got a kid, and yeah, I've met him, I remember him, little Johnny. They said, you realize he's now 12 or 13 years old, and he has never told us how he feels, or he's never told us anything about himself? And at first you think, well, you raised him, what's there to tell? And they go, well, no. It's we're not talking about behavior. The parent would say, we don't know what it is. It's spooky because he never says anything. I mean, he talks, but he never, he doesn't ever, I don't know, he doesn't reveal himself. It's like, that internally something's wrong. We don't know why. We've spent $50,000 on tests, and maybe you've just been a casual observer, and you say, well, I always see him smiling. He's out playing. Yeah. His motor skills, he walks all right, yeah. And he's passed every grade. Oh, yeah, makes good grades. Well, what is it? I see him out there playing, and I wave at him when I pass, and he waves. Yeah, I know. Well, he's not antisocial. I've never seen him fight. No, he doesn't fight, but Jesus, if you're around him, it took us a while. We kept thinking, my husband and I, or my wife and I, we'd talk about it. And we'd say, what is it with him? And finally, I don't know how ordinary people would ever arrive at this. I'm just doing it for them. They might have to send them to a psychologist and let somebody else put a name on it or something. And they would be hard-pressed to even get this, as simple as it sounds, to ever come to this kind of fairly plain talk, direct view of what it was. But they would say, it finally struck us, it's almost as though that he's lacking something in his internal life. Well, how do you know? I mean, what did he say? Well, that's just it. He hadn't said anything. And unless you were dyed-in-the-wool ordinary and carried away by it, then again you might want to stop and go, wait a minute. If he hadn't said anything about it and he hadn't complained, then why do you say it's a problem? And of course, if you're ordinary, if you were in their position, you would know it was a problem. The little tyke is not publicly spirited. He is not taking whatever his inner life is, what was previously his silent, personal, private life, and laid it out publicly. I'll leave it to you whether you, well, if you do not hear me, the description, if you were ordinary, even after telling you, if you had a kid doing that and you couldn't find anything else wrong, it was just that it suddenly struck you that he does not make his, assuming he has an ordinary private life and his behavior doesn't reflect otherwise, but he's never told you about it. Or you ever ask him, is there anything you want to tell me? He goes, no. Well, your feelings, like, when your grandmother died and, you never have to say anything about it. And the kid goes, huh? Well, I wondered how you felt about it. I wondered how you felt about so-and-so. And how do you feel about you'll be in high school next year, or junior high? All the other children were real excited. Several of your friends down the street had to go into counseling. They got so upset. There is a foot, and it's not psychological, is what I was getting at. It's a connection between those two different worlds. You have to take what was, it was meaningless because you could not stay there, but what was a private world, if you were strictly a physical creature. It's not possible today, and it wouldn't be profitable, but if you could have stayed there, you would be uncivilized. So you went from being something that was private into being something that was public, or else you're going to be crushed by it. You're going to be harmed by it. If they don't lock you up, they will counsel you forever, damn ever. They will test you. You'll have to talk to a psychologist, which I'll leave it up to you. Would you prefer to be killed by a lethal injection or have your fingernails pulled out? Or be in counseling for 50 years? Have to talk to a psychologist. So you have to take, and we'll give you this because this is an explanation that has never been made. This is what we're getting at. Another explanation. It's not better, it's not worse from an ordinary view, it's just almost inaudible from an ordinary view because it has no bias. It has no point to it. It has no purpose. I've got nothing to sell. The explanation has nothing to sell. The explanation will not get through, and then I say, well, we have now just enough time, and we'll put the address on the screen that you can write for so-and-so. So it is almost inaudible. You had to go from being a private creature. You had a private life and that was it. But you were not a human. You were a Homo sapien, but you were not a human. Then you had to get this going. And we'll assume that all of you are reasonably physically well and your nervous system generally intact. And it got going and you began to talk. What did you talk about? If you're ordinary, you could discuss it forever. That people debate. Men speak of matters all the way from politics to religion to the arts, etc., etc. Yes, but what's the one thing that you have got to talk about, or else be not just chastised and singled out, but you will suffer from a lack thereof. That is, you do not talk about you. And how do you talk about you if you're an ordinary sane person? Now, again, you could try to weasel your way out, or if you're an ordinary person, you'd look off in some other direction. Well, I talk about my job, and I talk about my family, I guess, and I talk about the Mets, how they're doing this year. In other words, you apparently talk about things sometimes external to yourself, right? I'll save you some time. You can make a log if you want to. But all of that, that's what people would say. And it says, well, I do. I talk a lot about stuff like that. Why are you attacking, talking about sports and wasting? No. But you're wrong. Ordinary people, that's not what they talk about. They talk about their private life. The rest of it is just so that you don't keep saying the same thing, apparently, over and over and over and over and over. Amongst your friends, you hang out with guys at the water cooler. You hang out with guys or gals after the work or the bar. And so that you don't say the same thing over and over, like one song over and over, it's throughout the days and the years. You change the key. You put in a new verse. You modulate a little bit. I know. People say, well, we talk about politics. Sometimes we'll talk about sports. Well, we don't talk about sports all the time down there. Most of us hang out, the same crowd, you're right. Usually we maybe 2 hours down there and we have cocktails before we get home. But sometimes we'll go off on politics, and we'll talk nothing about politics for 2 hours. And then again, sports, and then sometimes somebody will say something about a new art show, and we'll get talking about the arts. And sometimes we'll combine and we'll talk about the government's involvement with supporting the arts. Yeah. All you got to do is listen. They can do that, that doesn't matter. But that is not what people talk about. That is not what public sanity is. That is not public reality. All of that is just so that you're not apparently that you and your same friends and family stand, and you're going to be doing this little dance, let's just say cocktail hour after work. These 2 hours for the next 35 or 40 years, 5 days a week, so that, say there's 20 of you, and that all you do is the first guy. I guess you take turns, like the first guy, every day he goes, I still feel depressed most of the time. Another 19 go, well, now I'll take a sip. And then the second guy says, well, I not only feel depressed sometimes, but then again, at unexpected times, I feel so happy that I just know I'm going nuts. Now I go, well, now I'll take a drink. And this is the third guy. Instead of, well, if I describe it that way, of course, you'd go, well, nobody'd put up with that forever. Yeah, they do. But they don't put it that way, because one day they're apparently talking about the Mets. All you got to do is listen, and even the man's talking about the Mets, he doesn't talk about the Mets. No. Oh, he may in passing say something like, can you believe that Bubba Barnes is hitting 400? Now you could say that, all right, there's an exception. A man's not talking about himself. That is a grace note. It's like a pickup note in music. We're about to count off 1, 2, 3, 4, and the real song's about to start. The guy's about to really talk. We go 1, a 2, a 1, 2, and he goes a dum bump. It's the pickup note. That's the only thing you can say. Like, can you believe Bubba Barnes hitting 400? I can remember when I first started going to games. When my father, well, I tell you how far. Some of us were discussing. Well, I was talking to the guy up in the office, and we were trying to remember when's the last time somebody hit 400 in the American League at this point in the season. And I got to thinking. At first, we couldn't come up with a name, and I remember when my father used to. Do you hear? We're not talking about sports, and this is not an attack. This is another explanation of reality. A man is not talking about sports. If indeed a man in that crowd could stand there consistently, week after week, and never talk about himself, and we're talking about grown now, not family and children, the people around him, this will not happen. If it does, it won't happen the way I'm saying in a gradual way. But if a man, for some reason, stopped talking about himself and actually did. And he joined in. When they were apparently talking politics, he talked politics. But he talked about the public world of politics. He did not talk about himself privately. Within a reasonable length of time, his friends would begin to think, something's happened to him. You know, is he drinking too much? Is he got some problem at home? They would begin to have the same sort of feeling toward him without knowing why that my parents did in my story toward the kid. And it wouldn't happen gradually. If it did happen in ordinary life, there would indeed be something wrong. That he is drinking too much, he is dying, he is going nuts, or whatever explanation they have. But they would know, without being able to put a name on it, they would at the public level. They collectively, this is the first time somebody say, you know, they go to the bathroom, a couple of them, they'd say, have you noticed, you know, Fred, have you thought something funny going on? You know, another guy goes, well. Oh, I'm sorry. And his buddy says, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, I don't know. I don't know. That's why I brought it up. I'm not sure. And the other guy goes, well, you know, now that you mention it, I mean, is there something going, is he about to be fired? And you go, I don't know either. And the other guy goes, you know, it's funny you mention that. Because, you know, and they might say, is anybody else in the crowd? Has any other guys in accounting mentioned it? Well, no. And they just kind of go, well, you know, it's weird. But ordinarily, if something like that happens amongst public people, amongst ordinary people, you assume that it's man's depressed, or maybe, you know, he's got illness in the family, and normally it goes away. He comes back to being himself. It is not part of the sameness of life. It is not part of the general explanation that makes civilization, society as you know it at any time, any place, stay together. The withholding of your private life. At any ordinary level, it is solely unnatural. I went through the examples to point out, I assume that you've heard some of it now, that always from a child, of them feeling like, well, the child is not developing correctly. There is something amiss. And this explanation is so far removed, my little telling, if you'll think for a second, is why I took the effort to point out that the parents probably could not even come up with an explanation. I said they'd probably have to get it from a psychologist. If you want to know the truth, if this happened, a psychologist would never come up with that explanation. The explanation is another explanation. I always just didn't want to stop at the time I was using an example. A psychologist, a psychiatrist, any reasonable, sane public person today would not come up with a diagnosis of a apparently unresponsive, less than adequately socialized child in his development. The explanation would never be, well, Mr. and Ms. Smith, I have talked to the boy, I've had him here, I've lived with him, I've come over to your house, and we've spent X amount of months now, and I'm going to tell you what it is. You know what's getting all of us? All the tests, everything shows up, as we know when the family goes in. And the psychologist say, you know what it is? He doesn't talk about his private life. That is not the explanation you'd ever get. They could get close and they'd come up with something. I'm sure they got a diagnosis by now, number R7114 or something. And Fred's friends would never come up with an explanation. Never, never, never. If they talked about, isn't he weird? Something's wrong. Fred's not Fred. And all 19 of the 20 that hang out together, they all get together and agree, sober, away from Fred, they all go, it is, something is wrong. I'm glad we all got together. It's not just my imagination. Yes, Fred is not right. I mean, he's just not him. But remember, he hadn't done anything behaviorally. Nothing publicly. Nothing. His physical life gives away nothing. Except something is wrong. They would never come up with an explanation. Nobody would ever accidentally just go, what could it be? And they begin to pace the floor and they think, could it be his job? Could it be this? Nobody would finally go, well, this sounds weird, but could it be that what's striking us is they never talk about himself? Nobody would ever come up with that. That is not a general explanation. That's another explanation. That's not an explanation. That's another explanation. There was when I say they couldn't come up with explanations, by the way, every explanation has to have a reference point. A psychologist has to have one. If you took the child who was not developing and you took him to a psychologist, there has to be some sort of reference point on which the psychologist will eventually give an explanation. They call it diagnosis, etc., but to explain based upon his expertise and whatever they've done. But there has to be a reference point, whether it be whatever it is nowadays, psychology in general. But you have to be a Freudian psychologist, but he would give you a psychological explanation of the child. You would not go to a psychologist and him do all of the testing and counseling with your child about whom you were concerned, and him come up and say, all right, here I have the explanation, diagnosis. Here I have the explanation, and he gives you an explanation out of a chemistry book. He gives you an explanation based upon anthropology, mathematics, religion. That is not an explanation. The explanation, to have any sense, to be publicly acceptable, has to have a reference point. And you know what the reference point is going in. That's why you selected a particular institution. There could be other people who may first, or in the alternative, or second, may go to their religion and say, ask the rabbi, would you please talk to him, see what it is. And when you go back, you're not going to expect the rabbi to say, well, based upon certain, and he starts trying to give you some sort of artistic critique of the child, some psychiatric. You do not expect that. That is not what you went for. That would not be publicly acceptable. You would begin to think something's wrong with the rabbi. Like, hey, since when did you become a psychiatrist? I didn't want to hear that stuff. I was concerned that you could have some sort of insight. We've already been through that. The psychologist couldn't tell me anything. I wanted a priest or a religious view. To talk about there being another explanation for everything, there is always one. But remember, not better, not worse than an ordinary view. That is not insane and not wishful thinking. Just another one. From any ordinary view, there is no such thing as another explanation. Not the way I'm putting it. Another impartial explanation. It is not simply in the sense that there is no such thing in the public forum as impartial information, impartial diagnosis. It's not just that is in some way metaphorically correct. It is that it does not make sense in the explanation unless it has a bias, unless it has a view, unless it has a reference point. A psychological explanation does not make sense if it comes from a greengrocer. There could be the same diagnosis, that there you are looking at some cabbages for the weekend, and Mr. Philpott, whom you've known for years, says, are you still concerned about little Johnny? And you think, well, how'd he know? And you go, well, I hate to deal in gossip. I've been here in the neighborhood, and I heard that you had him counseled. And yeah, we did. Why? And he says, he gives you quickly some. He said, well, I've seen him go by here, and once I heard about it, and you've always been a good customer. And he suddenly gives you like a 2 or 3 line psychological diagnosis about, obviously, according to Mr. Philpott, what the basis of his neurosis. Now, it could be almost the same words. He might have gotten it out of the same book that the counselor that you spent several $1,000s on came up with the same thing. He didn't know, so he looks in the book and assumes you never read it either. And he says, well, here is my professional diagnosis. The point is, you understand, Mr. Philpott could give you the same words over the cabbages as Dr. So-and-so gave you over his $2,000 desk. But Mr. Philpott, you might go, well, he's a nice man, but it is not an explanation of the point. Because the reference point is not sane. The reference point is not acceptable to you. And not just you, it would not be publicly acceptable to anybody. If you had any sane friends, if you went home and you said, Mr. Philpott down at the, did you know he gave me a diagnosis of what's wrong with Johnny? A psychological, he just said, here it is. He said, I've watched him, I'll tell you what it is. Your friends would go, what? It would not be acceptable. Do you understand? It's beyond any point that it might be correct at their view. In other words, he gives you the same diagnosis that you spent mucho bucks for with a clinical child psychologist. You understand? He gives you the same diagnosis, same book. He just comes right out with it, and it's the same words. You understand it? That's not the validity of the diagnosis. It is not the correctness of the explanation. There is no proper reference point. It is not to the public good. So you'll say, I'm sorry, Mr. Philpott, I appreciate your concern about Johnny, but I'm going to have to go with what our psychologist said. Well, you just, some way, being blind to the fact that he gave you the exact same diagnosis. He memorized it out of the same book as your psychologist did. I'm sorry. Now, why is this second part not part of ordinary reality? Because although there is another explanation for everything, and if we'll now assume that you're past the point that we're not talking about an insane explanation, we're just doing it theoretically, that it's not an insane explanation, and it's not a better one, it's not a corrected explanation of the ordinary one, it's just another one. And if you held your attention with another one, but with no modifier, there's no qualifications on another explanation. Not better, not worse, just another one. Okay. If it is another one with no qualifications, it's also saying something else. And what is that? It has no reference point. It has no partisan view. It has no built-in bias. And bias is not as bad a word as most people are biased enough nowadays to assume. Because any thought a person has is biased, or you wouldn't think it. If there's another explanation that cannot be seen, which in fact creates another reality, another civilization going on. If there is another one that is not subject to, that is free from any qualifications, then it has no reference point. And that renders it what? Would you please tell us? I will. Damn near invisible and inaudible. Do what? What are all human institutions working at their best? What is religion? What is philosophy? Religion still being the one most widely viewed, if not participated in today, but in the public forum, in the public sense of reality. And psychology, now being part of the same institution, the same operational institution. What are they attempting to do? No matter what their stated goals are, because their stated goals have to do with the limitations of one lifetime, even though they keep repeating the same ones and it fits into the conformity and the predictability of life. What are they actually referring to? What they're attempting to offer. And people who pursue it, what are they attempting to gain is another explanation of things. That's it. But does it explain things in another way? And from an ordinary view, you can say, well, yeah, it does, because I grew up as a Muslim. I was never satisfied with it. I don't know why. And then I married a Jewish girl, and I converted. I started reading. I took instruction, and the more I thought about it, I thought, no real offense to my background, but this is a better explanation of life. It's indeed another one. Yes, it's another one. And the man says it's better. What if he took up, and they said, here's a new religion over here. If you're not satisfied with yours, come over here and try this one. He says, what is it? And nobody knows. Of course, it breaks down even for me to explain it, because then, unless I just stand here and do silent gestures, he says, well, what is a religion? And the person says, well, we don't have a name for it. Well, what do you actually teach as opposed to what I'm used to, like, Islam? Nothing. It's got. I assume that if it's not just, in some way vehemently anti-Islam, no, it's not that. Then I assume that and it's not exactly pro-Islam, or it'd be Islam, right? Yeah. So I assume that it's, just some sort of, bits and pieces that you find some. No, it's got nothing to do with it. Well, what's your attitude toward Islam? Well, we don't have one. Well, what's your attitude toward Christianity? We don't have one. Well, exactly what are your teachings? I mean, what could you tell me about them? Nothing. As always, it appears to be ridiculous. But that is the basis of man's internal, private struggle. The life itself, at the private level, that is the evolving of the human intellect. Not the body, not man physically, because we haven't changed that much in 2 or 3, 5, 6,000 years. It's not that much difference. It's here. And what does this seek? What can it seek? Isn't already into even deeper explanations that are so much of another explanation that I don't know what you're going to do, but here it is. The growth of the intellect seems to be fed by additionally gaining new explanations. That appears to be human progress, not just technical, but the evolution of man internally, spiritually, psychologically. What is it? Ordinary people might at first want to say, well, we have become wiser. We have become better educated. We have become more attuned. We have become better discoverers of the basic laws of nature. The softer laws of the social sciences, psychology, the harder physical laws of cosmology, particle physics, that we have new explanations continue to arise. That's what human progress is. True. But at that level, at the public level, every new explanation is biased. It has to be. To improve upon the last one, which from a public view, from a collective view, a good one that becomes reality itself, a new explanation, is an improvement over the last one. It's an expansion. But what if a man said, I have a brand new law. I have a new law of physics that's such that it will in fact eat up all the current laws and theories. That's the only way you get their attention, and the panel, the scientists or life says, well, tell us what it is. He says, no. You understand? I can't. But he could say no, and they say, well, you don't know it. Well, yes, I do. Well, you'd tell us. No, I'm not going to tell you. Well, you see where it's going nowhere. But what if he did? It's what I'm at with this. There's always another explanation, but if the explanation is not biased, if it is not a partisan explanation, which is not, from any ordinary view, necessarily a negative thing, contrary, because this new explanation of something, scientifically, a new explanation of a disease, a new explanation of what muscular dystrophy is, it might save someone's life. This new explanation will create new treatments. And now somebody you, a family member, may now live a longer life because of the new explanation. It has to be partisan. It has to have a reference point. If a man just says, I have a new explanation of illness, and for some reason he caught people's ear and they went, well, what is it? In what sense? He said, well, just illness. It's a new explanation. Well, tell us what it is specifically. And he said, well, it's nothing specifically. Well, I mean, what's this in regard to in some particular illness? All of them. Well, but, what kind of symptoms? When you say all of them, you're saying how it affects the body cellularly. No. In other words, you have no reference point to offer. You understand? It's just insanity. That's about the most charitable thing you could say. And to be a little more specific using my description, the kind of person that would hear that would say, well, it's not just insane, it's just no explanation. There's no need to call it an insane explanation. It's not even an explanation. But then look, if we're past now for a second, just theoretically, that the mind does seek another explanation. And what it seeks, and why it's never satisfied with those who have not absolutely forgotten the dream of this great place that you might go that'd be more fun to be at than even the eternal playground wherein you have the key to the good humor truck. If there is such a place, then you haven't found it. Not out in ordinary life, by ordinary explanations. And we're not talking about the physical life. We're not talking about just ice cream and sex and, clothes. We're talking about internally, in your personal private life. Religion didn't seem to do it, and whatever didn't do it. That every explanation, new explanation as they called it, here is the new explanation, here is the corrected explanation. That you went from being an orthodox something into being a liberal something. You went from being you thought that you increased, or that you would increase your pleasure, your understanding, by adopting the new explanation of something that you had already been involved with, be it religion, morality, family life, but it's all in here. The new explanation's never satisfied. If the mind could even think a little bit further than that, then it would even say, well, what that means is any explanation that has reference to any past explanation has got to be in some way less than what I'm looking for. Except simultaneously you would have to see that at the ordinary level that's not true, because the new explanation might save my life physically. It might help us all live better at the physical level. But internally, every new explanation has got to be, to even be heard, has got to be partisan. It has got to be an explanation of a previous explanation. It has got to be an attempted correction. It has got to be an expansion. It has got to be an elaboration of a previous explanation. Because if you stop and say, I have the answer, I have the corrected view, I know you people have wrestled with it now, what's it been? 4,000 years, speaking in general? But now, I personally now have figured out, understand, worked out, can prove, have a total, unqualified comprehension and answer to the problem of skillnadsprojektiv. So what? A man's got an explanation for something, for a problem, that you don't know what the problem is. And I'm not even going to try to repeat it. I assume you got the point. The man, you said, would you repeat that one more time? And the guy says the same thing. Well, the problem is an answer. If it's not a real question, it has no solution. What the hell is he talking about? He's nuts. But then you would be left with, if you were following that, if indeed you still had the kind of hunger for some extraordinary new explanation, and you realize, well, any explanation that is built upon a previous explanation is therefore biased, partisan, even with all good intentions, and may have good results. Like I said, that may offer a new cure for cancer, something plaguing you. So you can say, well, I got no complaint with that. Now, I'm going to use it. If they got a new drug, hey, count me in. But now we're talking about this, and you think, well, if there's an explanation, if there is another explanation like that, that's just completely other, just another explanation, it would not be an elaboration of a previous one. It would not be a correction. It would not be a criticism. It would not be anything. It would have no reference point. What would you be left with? That it would damn near be invisible and inaudible. Which easily, I'm sure you can guess, lends itself immediately and forever to all sorts of dreams of mysticism, religion, fairy tales, that the idea of some sort of parallel reality. It was not just a dream of Captain Kirk or Buck Rogers or somebody, or H.G. Wells. There's an, I always knew it. And of course, then it gets into people believe there's a spiritual world going on here. There's dead people around, or people that used to be dead, and now they got a Buick. Or that the gods are here. People used to, they used to believe that the gods and spirits were hanging around right next door to you and living in your house. Now it's a little bit more that they believe, perhaps. Well, you know as many speculations that there's parallel universes. Go through a black hole and time goes backwards. Space turns sideways, and there's another reality. It's always been there, that idea. And it is. But the other reality is just beyond whatever the present explanation of reality is. Whatever the explanation is, the parallel reality, the parallel world, the other world, the afterworld, every other dream is what? Another explanation. And people, you could even get them for a second, go, yes, that's it. If you know what it is, would you tell us? I've been looking. But if you tried to tell them, it's got no reference point. And so they go, what? You say, yes, there is, as you call it, a parallel reality. There is another explanation that eats every other explanation up alive. Ha, tell me.